So if you just get in a position that you're basically comfortable in and you can remain reasonably still, you don't have to be perfectly still. You can allow the eyelids to close. If it doesn't feel right to close them totally, just let them close to whatever level it feels right. So we've been focusing on thinking for the last while, and for this period, we don't have to focus on thinking anymore. We have total permission to acknowledge the larger happening of the moment. And that's not difficult to do because right now, your only life experience is the feeling of the happening of this moment, the big happening of this moment. What you call seeing, hearing, touching, all the tactile sensations, the body sensations, tasting, smelling, and thinking. So thinking is a natural portion of the big happening of this moment, but it's not everything. It's just one small portion of the happening of this moment. And we can allow the focus to come off that one small happening and feel the larger event of the moment. We don't have to struggle to do this. Right now, there is the feeling of this happening of the moment. And in this moment, it will be presenting certain physical sensations that are very strong. They're presenting themselves and they make themselves obvious. They make themselves known. So just to get very clear that the happening of this moment is not a thought, I want you to think a question. What is there when there's no thinking? And at the end of the question, for a moment, there won't be any thinking, but it doesn't feel like nothingness. Feel the happening that remains. You can do this a few times. What is there when there's no thinking? And then just feel the happening that presents itself at the end of that question. Now, that's not to get rid of thought. Thinking is a natural portion of this happening of the moment, and it will come back in its own way, in its own time. We're just being clear that the happening of this moment is not a thought. So we have these words that point to the happening of this moment, but the happening itself is not a word. We have this happening that we call seeing. So when I say this word, that points to a happening that's not a word. And even if we don't call that happening anything, it still makes itself obvious. There's a happening we call sound or hearing. Again, the word points to an actual happening that's not a word. And even if we don't call it anything, there's still this happening making itself obvious, this happening that we call sound or we call hearing. There's a happening that we call touch or tactile sensations, all the body sensations. There are maybe pulsations, vibrations, a little bit of tingling. There could be warmth or coolness. There could be heaviness or lightness. There could be tightness or looseness. There's what we call the breath coming and going, the heart beating. Whatever presents itself, these words simply point to this happening that we call the body or body sensations. But the happening itself is not a word. And even if we don't call it anything, that happening makes itself obvious. There's the happening we call tasting. And the happening we call smelling. Again, these words are pointing to a happening that's not a word. It's some vibrant occurrence, some vibrant event that is making itself known, it's making itself obvious. And there's the happening we call thinking. Thoughts will come and go as a natural portion of this larger happening of this moment. Now, we don't have to struggle to find this happening of life. It's the only thing we experience. It's the only thing we actually feel, this big happening of this moment. And if we rest totally, if we make no effort at all, this happening goes on happening. It keeps presenting itself. In fact, it presents the happening that we are. Everything that we feel we are is simply presenting itself in this moment. Nothing to change, nothing else to be, nothing else to get to. If we go looking for our life, this is the only thing we can find, the feeling of this happening at this moment. Now, I want to ask you, does this happening feel like the past? Does it feel like the future? Or does it feel like what we call the happening of now? So we don't need to meditate for 30 years to discover that. We can just feel, does this feel like the past? Does it feel like the future? Does it feel like the happening of this moment? This is something that many people don't notice, that all we ever experience is the feeling of something happening now. No one has ever experienced the past. We think about a past. No one has ever experienced a future. We only think about a future. The only thing we actually experience is this feeling of this happening right now. We don't even have to call it now. Just this mysterious happening presenting itself, the feeling of this vibrant occurrence, this mysterious, vibrant occurrence presenting itself. Thoughts may come and go very naturally. Thoughts may be very strong and they may grab the attention for a moment, and that's totally fine. That's part of the movement of this vibrant occurrence. But for this period of time, we don't have to stay focused on the thinking. The larger happening of the moment can invite us back. The larger happening can invite the attention. We can acknowledge this happening that we call the body in greater detail. There's the happening we call the feet. So this word feet points to a happening that's not a word. There's just a feeling of this vibrant occurrence that's not a word. We don't have to call it anything, and it makes itself obvious. There's the happening we call the lower legs, from the ankles to the knees. When I say these words to point to this happening that we call the lower legs, from the ankles to the knees, it simply points to whatever happening is making itself obvious. There's the happening we call the upper legs, from the knees to the hips. There's the happening we call the belly and the lower back and the bum. Again, these words just point to a happening that's not a word. And we simply feel this happening, which is not difficult, because our life is only the feeling of this happening. There's the happening of the chest and the upper back. There's the happening that we call the right arm, the right shoulder, the right elbow, the right wrist, the right hand. There's the happening we call the left arm, the left shoulder, the left elbow, the left wrist, the left hand. There's the happening we call the palms of the hands. There's the happening we call the fingers. There's the happening we call the thumbs. Again, these words simply point to a happening that's not a word, and even if we don't call it anything, that happening makes itself obvious. And even if one portion of this happening is making itself obvious, there will be other portions that will present themselves in a very obvious way at the same time. There's the happening we call the neck, and the jaws, and the teeth, and the tongue, and the throat opening. There's the happening we call the lips, and the upper lip, and the space just above the upper lip. There's the happening we call the nostrils, and the ears, and the back of the head. There's the happening we call the eyes, and the eyelids. There's the happening we call the eyebrows. Often we feel we can't get through life unless we pull the eyebrows tightly together, that we can't manage to live life without eyebrows pulled together. In this moment, we don't need them pulled together. We can just feel the happening that we call eyebrows. There's the happening we call the space just above the eyes, just above the ears, coming to what we call the very top of the head. So we have this entire happening that we call the body, or you could say it's a collection of little happenings, but it's also one big happening. But even that isn't everything in this moment. There's the happening we call seeing. Even if the eyes are closed, there's still a happening that we can point to with the word seeing, and that happening is not a word. We simply feel that happening. There's the happening we call sound or hearing. Again, the words point to this happening that's not a word. There is just this feeling of a happening that we call sound or hearing. There's a happening we call tasting and smelling. There's the happening we call breath coming and going, heart beating, pulsation, vibration, tingling, waves of energy, tightness, looseness, heaviness, lightness. Whatever presents itself, if I use a word and there isn't a happening presenting itself, it's no problem. Just whatever is presenting itself is fine. This big happening of the moment. seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, and thinking. Thoughts coming and going as a natural portion of this happening of the moment. Nothing to create, nothing to struggle with, just this happening, presenting itself. One moment thought making itself obvious, the next moment breath making itself obvious, the next moment tingling making itself obvious, the next moment sound making itself obvious. Does it feel like you're making anything happen in this moment, or is everything just happening? If you make no effort at all in this moment, does the happening of this moment stop happening? Does the happening that you are stop happening? Or does it go on presenting itself? Some people say self-radiant. This vibrant occurrence expressing itself. When we were born, this is what presented itself, the feeling of this happening. And we had no word for it. We had no story about it. There was just this feeling happening. The feeling of this happening. Now we have labels for it. We have stories about it. But these labels and stories just point to this happening that's not a word. And the thinking is just a movement that's part of this mysterious happening. Nothing to change, nothing to create, nothing to struggle with. Just this happening. Ajahn Chah used to say, just be a still flowing stream. Just be this happening. There's a feeling of stillness because there's no struggle with it. There's just this happening. Does this feeling of this happening, does it feel dull and fixed and unchanging? Or does it feel subtle and lively, breath coming and going, thoughts coming and going, sounds coming and going, pulsation, vibration, waves of energy, tingling, a little twinge here, a little twinge there, a little pain here, a little shift there. One moment, thought presenting itself, the next moment, tingling presenting itself, the next moment, sound presenting itself. Just this happening. Does it feel unchanging and dull and fixed? Or does it feel lively and vibrant, moving and shifting and dancing in subtle ways? Sometimes it gets unclear as to what's a description and what's the actual happening. So we can think the question, what is there when there's no description? And simply rest at the end of that question and feel the happening that remains. The thinking, the descriptions will come back as the natural part of this happening. And that movement of thought is part of this mysterious happening just presenting itself. We don't really know what thought is. Somebody told us to call it thought. We don't really know what seeing is. Somebody told us to call it seeing. But the labels can only point to this happening. This vibrant, moving, shifting event. Buddha said, if we come to what actually is, we come to the unformed. Basically, this vibrant, moving, shifting event of life. It doesn't have a particular form. It's a movement, an action, a vital expression presenting itself, presenting everything that we are in this moment. Jesus said, if you sit quietly, you will feel the spirit moving within you, the moving, dancing presence that the Great Spirit actually is. The Taoists said, there is only the Tao, and it's flowing like water, and there is only the way it flows. So the word Tao means the way this vibrant happening flows. It simply presents itself. And we're part of the presentation. In this moment, everything that we feel we are is part of this one big happening of the moment. Just one big happening. The unformed ocean of existence, the river of life, the Great Spirit, the Tao. Nowhere else to get to. If we go looking for our life, this is the only thing we can actually find. Nothing else to be. We are this unexplainable happening simply presenting itself. There are no incorrect expressions of this happening. There is only this mysterious happening presenting itself. Self-luminous, self-radiant, uncaused, unformed. So with that, we can allow this very detailed acknowledgement of our life, this detailed acknowledgement of the happening that we are. We can allow that to come to rest. This mysterious happening goes on presenting itself, but we don't have to be so focused on the big happening. There are things that we need to do in the next little while, and that will require a focus on our storylines. And so we simply use the storylines that are presented. We follow the things that make sense to us. So you can move in whatever way seems appropriate. You can shift in whatever way that seems most appropriate. You're going to have to be a little more active in a few minutes. So if you're looking for the fullness of what you are, that's it. That's what it feels like to be what you are instead of thinking about what you are. That happening is there to be acknowledged in any moment. Sometimes we need to be focused on thought. When you're not needing to be focused on that thought, are you willing to come back to the vibrant happening that you are? To the natural expression that you are? You're just as natural as any other expression of existence. And we find our fullness in being the expression that we are. If a swan tries to be a duck, it starts feeling that it's an ugly duckling. It's the same with us. If we ignore the legitimate, valid expression that we are and try to be something else, we feel like we're an ugly duckling. So Ruth was inviting us to honor our own expression and to honor the expression, all the other expressions of humankind, all the other expressions of nature.